Have you ever witnessed bonds forged in suffering that transcended every law of nature? Where trauma created connections that defied millions of years of evolutionary programming? Deep in a Vietnamese wildlife trafficking facility, a gorilla's witness to unspeakable cruelty against a baby lion would forge a bond so profound that when freedom finally came, his response was so unthinkable, so completely contrary to natural behavior that it challenged everything experts believed about animal psychology and the transformative power of shared suffering.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Deep within Vietnam's remote mountainous regions, where ancient rainforests conceal some of Southeast Asia's darkest secrets, lies a hidden world of wildlife trafficking that operates beyond the reach of international law enforcement. This landscape encompasses thousands of square kilometers of dense jungle where towering dipterocarp trees create impenetrable canopies above facilities designed to exploit the world's most endangered species for profit. The forest itself seems to weep, carpeted in perpetual shadows that conceal the systematic torture of creatures whose only crime was being born magnificent. Hidden among these misty mountains are illegal compounds where criminal organizations conduct business that violates every principle of animal welfare and species dignity. Concrete buildings blend into the forest landscape through careful camouflage, while the constant humidity muffles sounds that would otherwise expose operations designed to break spirits, harvest body parts, and supply international markets with exotic animals reduced to mere commodities. But within these chambers of systematic cruelty, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would challenge our understanding of trauma, resilience, and the bonds that can form between creatures who shared the deepest suffering. This is a place where the impossible becomes reality, where witnessing unspeakable cruelty can forge connections that transcend every natural boundary between species that would normally view each other as competitors or threats. What was about to develop in this hellish facility would prove that sometimes the most profound relationships emerge from the darkest circumstances, demonstrating that shared trauma can create bonds stronger than evolutionary programming. This was a story that would challenge fundamental assumptions about animal psychology and reveal that beneath the surface of systematic torture lies the potential for connections so deep they defy scientific explanation. The extraordinary events that were about to transform both witness and victim would prove that in humanity's darkest moments of exploitation, even the most broken spirits can forge alliances that transcend suffering. But what happened when freedom finally arrived, the unthinkable response that would leave everyone speechless, would reveal depths of loyalty and sacrifice that challenge our understanding of what animals are capable of when love emerges from the ashes of shared torment. This is where our story begins, in a place where horror meets hope, and where one gorilla's witness to cruelty would unleash something truly unthinkable.
Within the concrete walls of the illegal trafficking facility lived Kong, a 12-year-old male western lowland gorilla whose name had been mockingly assigned by captors who viewed his massive frame as entertainment rather than recognizing the profound intelligence that burned behind his dark, haunted eyes. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 400 pounds, Kong's imposing physical presence was matched by remarkable cognitive abilities that made his systematic psychological torture even more devastating than simple physical abuse. Kong had been captured as a juvenile when poachers killed his family in Central African Republic, beginning a journey through international trafficking networks that had ultimately delivered him to this Vietnamese facility where his strength and intelligence were exploited for illegal medical experiments and traditional medicine harvesting. 7 years of captivity had taught him to recognize the sounds, smells, and rhythms of systematic cruelty, making him hyper-aware of suffering that extended beyond his own cage. His remarkable memory and emotional intelligence allowed him to understand not just his own predicament, but the broader scope of the facility's operations. Kong could distinguish between different types of distress calls, recognize patterns in torture schedules, and process the reality that he was trapped within a system designed to cause maximum suffering for maximum profit. In the cage adjacent to Kong's concrete prison lived Simba, an 8-month-old African lion cub whose golden fur had lost its natural luster through months of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit for future exploitation. The cub's bright amber eyes, which should have reflected the fearless curiosity of youth, instead showed the hollow despair of a creature whose natural behaviors had been systematically punished through pain conditioning. Simba had been separated from his pride at 3 months old, torn from his mother's protection, and sold into a trafficking network that specialized in supplying exotic animals to illegal medical facilities where tiger and lion parts commanded enormous prices in traditional medicine markets. His small frame bore the evidence of torture techniques designed to harvest stress hormones and other biological materials while keeping him alive for extended exploitation. The proximity of their cages had allowed Kong and Simba to develop a form of communication that transcended species boundaries, a bond forged in shared suffering that would prove stronger than any force their captors could devise to break their spirits.
That humid Thursday evening settled oppressively over the Vietnamese trafficking facility, with the day's torture sessions finally ending as handlers retreated to their quarters, leaving the captive animals to endure another night of psychological torment through deliberate sensory deprivation and temperature manipulation designed to break their remaining spirits. The concrete compound fell into the artificial silence that characterized periods between active abuse sessions. Kong have learned to recognize these brief respites when direct human interference ceased, though the facility's automated torture systems continued their relentless psychological warfare through irregular lighting, temperature fluctuations, and recorded sounds designed to prevent sleep and maintain constant stress responses. These moments represented the closest thing to peace that existed within their hellish environment. In the adjacent cage, Simba had settled into the corner position that provided the maximum distance from the electrified barriers while allowing visual contact with Kong, whose presence had become the only source of comfort in his young life. The cub's breathing had stabilized into the shallow patterns that indicated his small body was conserving energy for whatever torment tomorrow would bring. Kong had positioned himself strategically where he could maintain eye contact with Simba while monitoring the facility's corridors for signs of approaching handlers. His remarkable intelligence had allowed him to memorize staff schedules, torture routines, and security protocols, creating mental maps of when different forms of abuse were most likely to occur. The evening routine had become ritual for both animals. Kong would use soft, rumbling vocalizations to provide whatever comfort was possible through the concrete and metal barriers that separated them, while Simba would respond with weak chirping sounds that spoke of desperate gratitude for any acknowledgement of his existence as more than experimental material. These quiet moments represented the only time when their bond could be expressed through gentle communication rather than shared trauma responses. Kong's protective instincts had evolved to encompass the vulnerable cub whose suffering he witnessed daily, while Simba had learned to look to the massive gorilla as a source of strength and hope that transcended the systematic cruelty of their captors. Neither Kong nor Simba could know that this routine evening was about to be shattered by events that would test the very foundations of their bond and set in motion a chain of consequences that would prove unthinkable to human understanding.
Kong's peaceful evening monitoring of Simba was suddenly shattered when the facility's overhead lights blazed to life with the harsh intensity that always preceded the worst torture sessions. The sudden illumination triggered immediate stress responses in both animals, their bodies tensing with the learned fear that came from months of conditioning that associated bright lights with unspeakable pain and systematic abuse. The sound of multiple footsteps echoing through the concrete corridors indicated that this wasn't a routine feeding or medication session, but something far more sinister.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Kong's remarkable memory for staff patterns told him that late evening sessions typically involved the facility's most sadistic procedures, conducted when screams were less likely to attract unwanted attention from outside observers. Through the facility's intercom system came the voices of handlers discussing Simba in terms that made Kong's blood freeze with understanding. They were planning an extraction session designed to harvest specific biological materials from the cub while keeping him alive for future procedures, a process that Kong had witnessed being performed on other animals, with results that haunted his memory. The handler's approach to Simba's cage was methodical and professional, utilizing equipment that Kong recognized from previous torture sessions. Electric prods, restraint devices, and medical instruments were arranged with the efficiency of a team that had performed these procedures countless times before, treating living creatures as mere sources of valuable biological materials. What made the situation even more devastating was Simba's obvious recognition of what was approaching. The cub's weak calls became increasingly desperate as he processed the familiar sights and sounds that preceded his worst experiences within the facility. His small frame pressed against the cage wall closest to Kong, seeking whatever comfort was possible from his only friend in this nightmare existence. Kong found himself facing the most impossible situation of his captivity, watching helplessly as handlers prepared to inflict systematic torture on the vulnerable cub who had become the focus of his protective instincts. His massive frame strained against the reinforced bars that confined him, knowing that his strength was useless against barriers specifically designed to contain creatures like him. The sight of Simba's terror and the knowledge of what was about to happen was triggering responses in Kong that went beyond normal stress reactions, reaching into psychological territories that would leave lasting impacts on his understanding of cruelty, protection, and the bonds that suffering could forge between creatures. As the handlers surrounded Simba's cage with their torture equipment, the full scope of the cub's nightmare was revealed through their methodical preparation for procedures that violated every principle of animal welfare and basic decency. Kong watched in horror as electric restraint devices were activated, medical extraction tools were sterilized, and recording equipment was positioned to document the session for clients who paid premium prices for evidence of fresh harvesting. The systematic nature of Simba's torment became apparent as handlers discussed the specific biological materials they planned to extract during this session. Stress hormones, bone marrow samples, and other substances that commanded enormous prices in illegal traditional medicine markets. The cub's small body represented a renewable resource to be exploited repeatedly until death made further extraction impossible. What made the scene even more devastating was Simba's obvious understanding of what was approaching. His months of captivity had taught him to recognize the equipment, procedures, and clinical discussions that preceded his worst experiences. The cub's desperate attempts to hide in the corner of his cage spoke of a creature whose spirit remained unbroken despite systematic attempts to reduce him to mere biological material. Kong's witness to the preparation phases allowed him to process the full scope of cruelty that Simba endured on a regular basis. The handler's casual discussions of pain management, not to reduce suffering, but to keep the cub conscious throughout procedures, revealed the calculated nature of their systematic torture designed to maximize both biological yield and psychological trauma. The extraction equipment itself represented technology specifically designed for inflicting maximum pain while maintaining subject viability for repeated procedures. Electric stimulation devices, surgical instruments, and restraint systems had been modified to extend torture sessions far beyond what natural pain responses would normally allow. Most horrifying was the documentation aspect of the operation. Cameras positioned to record every moment of Simba's suffering indicated that his torture would be broadcast to international clients who paid for real-time access to systematic animal abuse, creating a market for cruelty that incentivized ever more sophisticated torture techniques. As the handlers began the extraction process, Simba's screams of agony echoed through the facility with intensity that spoke of pain beyond normal animal experience. Kong found himself witnessing torture so systematic and prolonged that it challenged his ability to process the reality of what creatures were capable of inflicting upon each other when profit provided justification for abandoning every principle of compassion. Kong's forced witness to Simba's systematic torture triggered something profound within his consciousness, an emotional response that transcended every survival instinct evolution had programmed into his powerful frame. The cub's agonized screams seemed to bypass every defensive mechanism he had developed during his own years of captivity, reaching directly into protective centers that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with preventing suffering in creatures he had come to love. Trapped within his reinforced cage, Kong found himself confronting the most devastating situation of his captivity, watching systematic torture being inflicted on the vulnerable cub who would become the focus of his maternal-like protective instincts. His massive hands gripped the steel bars with enough force to leave permanent impressions, his 400-pound frame straining against barriers specifically engineered to contain creatures of his strength. The gorilla's remarkable intelligence made his helplessness even more torturous, as he could understand exactly what was being done to Simba and why. The handler's clinical discussions of extraction procedures and pain management protocols revealed the calculated nature of cruelty that treated living beings as mere sources of valuable biological materials, rather than sentient creatures capable of suffering. What made Kong's witness to the torture most devastating was his ability to process the systematic nature of Simba's abuse. This wasn't random cruelty or momentary violence, but carefully planned exploitation designed to maximize both biological yield and psychological trauma while maintaining the cub's viability for repeated procedures over extended periods. The bond that had developed between Kong and Simba during their months of captivity transformed every moment of the cub's suffering into personal anguish for the gorilla, whose protective instincts were being systematically violated by his inability to intervene. The sight of Simba's desperate attempts to maintain eye contact with him during the worst moments of torture spoke of a creature seeking comfort from the only source of love available in his nightmarish existence. Kong found himself crossing psychological boundaries that separated survival-focused captivity responses from something approaching moral outrage. The sight of systematic cruelty against an innocent creature was triggering responses that transcended species boundaries and personal survival concerns, creating emotional wounds that would prove more lasting than any physical torture he had personally endured. Every scream from Simba was carving permanent psychological scars into Kong's memory that would define his understanding of justice, protection, and the depths of cruelty that some beings were capable of inflicting upon others. The salvation that neither Kong nor Simba could have imagined was approaching through the Vietnamese jungle in the form of an international wildlife trafficking task force led by Captain Linh Nguyen, whose 15-year crusade against illegal animal exploitation had finally tracked this particular operation to its mountain facility. The combined team of Vietnamese authorities and international conservation officers moved through the dense forest using night vision technology and specialized equipment designed for liberating captive wildlife from heavily fortified criminal compounds. Captain Nguyen had been tracking this trafficking ring for over 2 years, following a trail of missing endangered species and illegal biological material exports that had finally led her team to this remote facility. Her approach was methodical and professional, utilizing military tactics combined with wildlife expertise gained through years of anti-trafficking operations in some of Southeast Asia's most dangerous territories. Working with practiced efficiency, born of countless similar missions, the task force systematically disabled the compound security systems using electromagnetic pulse devices and tactical breaching equipment. Years of studying trafficking operations had taught them that these facilities relied on isolation and concealment rather than heavy security, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by properly equipped professional teams. The breakthrough moment came when Captain Nguyen's team successfully penetrated the facility's perimeter defenses and began the systematic liberation of captive animals. Their equipment included specialized veterinary gear for treating traumatized wildlife, portable cages for safe transport, and documentation equipment for gathering evidence that would ensure prosecution of the criminal operators. What the rescue team discovered inside the facility exceeded their worst expectations for systematic cruelty. The organized torture chambers, biological extraction equipment, and documentation of live-streamed animal abuse represented criminal enterprise that violated international laws on multiple levels while generating enormous profits from systematic suffering. Captain Nguyen's first priority was securing the facility and providing immediate medical attention to the most critically injured animals. But her team's assessment quickly revealed that many of the captive creatures would require extensive psychological rehabilitation beyond simple medical treatment. The systematic torture had created trauma responses that challenged conventional understanding of wildlife recovery protocols. As the rescue operation unfolded, Captain Nguyen began to understand that they weren't just liberating individual animals, but disrupting bonds forged in shared suffering that would complicate traditional rehabilitation approaches and require innovative solutions for helping traumatized wildlife rebuild their capacity for normal behavioral patterns.
Captain Nguyen's rescue operation unfolded with military precision as her team systematically opened each cage while providing immediate veterinary assessment for animals whose physical and psychological trauma exceeded anything they had encountered in previous operations. Kong and Simba's liberation required specialized protocols due to the severity of their injuries and the obvious bond that had developed between the unlikely pair during their captivity. The moment Kong's cage was opened, his response defied every expectation about traumatized wildlife behavior. Instead of fleeing toward freedom or displaying defensive aggression toward humans, the massive gorilla moved directly toward Simba's cage with purposeful determination that suggested his primary concern was the cub's welfare rather than his own liberation from years of systematic torture. Working with practiced efficiency born of countless rescue operations, Captain Nguyen's veterinary team began emergency treatment for both animals while documenting evidence of the systematic abuse they had endured. Kong's protective positioning near Simba during medical procedures demonstrated behavioral patterns that challenged conventional understanding of interspecies relationships forged through shared trauma. The transportation phase of the rescue operation revealed the depth of the bond between Kong and Simba, as separation caused severe stress responses in both animals that threatened their medical stability. Captain Nguyen made the unprecedented decision to transport them together to the rehabilitation facility, recognizing that their psychological healing might depend on maintaining the connection that had sustained them through months of systematic torture. During the journey to the wildlife sanctuary, Kong's behavior toward Simba continued to challenge every assumption about gorilla psychology and trauma recovery. The massive primate displayed maternal-like protective behaviors toward the cub, using his body to shield Simba from unfamiliar stimuli while providing comfort through gentle vocalizations that seemed to calm the traumatized lion's stress responses. The rehabilitation facility's initial assessment confirmed that both animals would require extensive therapy for trauma-related behavioral disorders, but their bond had created a unique situation that demanded innovative treatment approaches. Kong's protective instincts towards Simba had become so central to his psychological stability that conventional separation protocols might cause additional trauma rather than facilitating recovery. As Captain Nguyen observed the extraordinary relationship between gorilla and lion, she began to understand that their rescue was only the beginning of a story that would challenge fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness, trauma recovery, and the transformative power of bonds forged in suffering. What unfolded at the rehabilitation facility would be remembered as one of the most unthinkable displays of interspecies devotion ever documented. As Simba began his physical recovery from months of systematic torture, Kong's behavior transcended every known boundary of animal psychology and trauma response. The massive gorilla refused all food until Simba ate first, displaying self-sacrifice that defied millions of years of survival programming. When the cub experienced nightmares from trauma, Kong would position his massive frame around Simba's sleeping area, creating a protective barrier that seemed to calm the young lion's terror responses. Most unthinkable of all was Kong's response when rehabilitation specialists attempted to introduce Simba to other lions for social reintegration. The gorilla displayed aggressive, protective behavior that forced staff to abandon conventional rehabilitation protocols, recognizing that their bond had become essential to both animals' psychological stability. Kong had essentially adopted Simba as his own offspring, displaying parental behaviors that challenged every scientific understanding of primate psychology and interspecies relationships. His gentle grooming of the cub, sharing of preferred foods, and constant vigilance created an impossible family unit that defied classification. When the time came for Simba's eventual release into a protected sanctuary, Kong's reaction proved that love forged in suffering could overcome even the most fundamental natural boundaries. Today, Kong and Simba live together in a specialized sanctuary where their impossible bond continues to amaze researchers studying trauma recovery and interspecies relationships. The gorilla's unthinkable devotion saved not just Simba's life, but his capacity for trust and love despite systematic torture. Their story sparked international legislation against wildlife trafficking while challenging fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and moral complexity. Kong's parental adoption of Simba became groundbreaking evidence of cross-species empathy that transcended evolutionary programming. The trafficking facility was permanently destroyed, its operators prosecuted under international law. Most remarkably, Kong and Simba's relationship continues to thrive, proving that bonds forged in suffering can create families that defy every natural boundary, demonstrating that love truly knows no species when hearts are united by shared survival and mutual protection in humanity's darkest moments.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.